Hey guys! So last week on the Hala for Samala blog, I talked about the core and its relationship with your diaphragm and your pelvic floor. I want to talk today more about that relationship of diaphragm and pelvic floor and how posture plays so much into it. A lot of times in yoga, we talk about good posture, and even just in movement practice in general, you have to stand up straight. But we never really talk about the anatomics of why standing up straight is important. So the diaphragm is this big parachute-like muscle, and it lines the inside of your rib cage. So it goes all the way around the inside of you, and it separates your heart and your lungs above from your guts and the liquid contents of your abdomen below. So 20,000 times a day, which is about average of how many breaths a day you take, the diaphragm contracts and it flies back up. It contracts and it flies back up. Again, this is 20,000 reps a day. Imagine if you had to do a bicep curl 20,000 times a day. You would want to be sure that you had impeccable form and impeccable alignment. Thankfully, you only have to think about the diaphragm, not as much as the muscle contracting, but we do need to think about our alignment. So a visualization I like to think about the diaphragm and why having alignment and a suppleness and flexibility to the entire muscle, because it is muscle and you have control over it. While your breath is involuntary, unless you're thinking every second, inhale, exhale. Hopefully you don't have to think that. So the breath is involuntary, but you can control your breath, right? Think of holding your breath underwater when you swim. Right? So it's a muscle that's both controlled voluntarily and involuntarily. And again, the visualization I like to use is this idea of kids on a playground with that big rainbow parachute. And maybe when you were in elementary school, you were able to play with this. So the kids all stand in a circle and everybody holds onto an edge of the parachute. And in a perfect situation, at the same time, everybody raises and lowers their arms and maybe bends their knees as well. So the parachute very uniformly flies up and down, just like the diaphragm would move. Now, think of that little snot-faced kid who decides, you know what, I'm not going to participate today. I'm just going to stand here and do nothing. And they get stiff and they hold their section of the parachute without movement. So now the floating of the parachute up and down isn't as smooth as it can be. There's a tug somewhere where there's no movement. This happens as well in your own body and your own diaphragm. If you have crispy abs, if your front of your body, your rectus abdominis, the obliques, the transverse are so stiff because you do nothing but core exercise and never get on a soft ball and roll out these tissues, you can imagine that their fascial connections with the diaphragm, because remember it wraps all the way around, their fascial connections are stiff, and that makes that portion of the diaphragm a little bit stiff as well. So that's why maintaining suppleness, flexibility, fluidity throughout all of your tissues, not just, the painful traps in the upper back, but even here in the core is so important. Now, the relationship of the diaphragm with the core, so again, 20,000 times a day, the diaphragm contracts down and then flies back up. So the contraction pulls it down, and then the relaxation, right, allows it to rebound back up. Now, because of the abdominal contents, right, it's a liquid system. So as the diaphragm contracts and presses down, all of the pressure has to go somewhere. Thankfully, the pelvic floor in a perfect situation allows for just enough downward, just a teeny tiny bit of give. And you probably are not even aware of this unless you spend a lot of time working on awareness of your pelvic floor with massage or meditation or what have you. So diaphragm contracts, it presses abdominal contents down by increasing the pressure. Pelvic floor poofs out just a little bit, thankfully not too much. And then on the exhale, right, everything flies back up, the pelvic floor is pulled up. So when your rib cage and your pelvis are perfectly stacked on top of one another, as they should be when you're standing properly, then the diaphragm and the pelvic floor stretch and tone one another all day. Right? Diaphragm flies up, pelvic floor goes up, diaphragm comes down, pelvic floor presses down. So they work together to keep each other flexible, mobile, and toned enough against, the forces of gravity, as well as breathing exercises. Like in yoga, we talk about Uddiyana Bandha, which is a diaphragmatic lock, which gives this huge stretch for the diaphragm. Well, the pelvic floor, if all the tissues are supple around the core, it gets stretched as well. So remember, there's not this direct connection from the diaphragm to the pelvic floor. So it's not like there's a pole in the center that pulls everything up and down. It's all the way around the connections from top to bottom. And you're not a square, you're more oval shaped, roundish. So all of those connections all the way around are helping to keep pelvic floor and diaphragm in relationship to one another. But again, posture is key. So just to play on that, let's see if I can back up far enough away. So ideally in standing, your toes are pointing forward and your rib cage is right on top of your pelvis. So if I get my hands out of the way here, you can see that I'm doing my best to align the front of my rib cage with the front of my pelvis, the pubic bone. And this happens regardless of what soft tissue is beyond this, whether you are slightly overweight, if you are pregnant, if you're larger, body mass, however you carry your body fat. You're looking at your bony structure for your alignment, not your soft tissue structure. So when the rib cage shears forward like this and the pelvis goes back, instead of the 20,000 reps of the diaphragm stretching and toning the pelvic floor, your diaphragm is just bursting its pressure forward onto the front anterior portion of your abdomen. So we see diastasis recti a lot of time in pregnant women, but there's a pooching outwards of the front of the body that can also happen with poor posture, right? The whole front line of the body is unable to keep and maintain its integrity because it's being stretched all day long when you breathe. In that same situation, the pelvic floor is not getting that simultaneous stretch and tone as it would when you're perfectly stacked. So the pelvic floor suffers as well. We see a huge number of people with prostate issues, organ prolapse in women, and pelvic floor urinary incontinence, fecal incontinence. I mean, all of these kinds of pelvic floor issues. And it's not to say that this would cure that, but at all. But you can really do yourself a favor in maintaining the health of your body by just looking at your posture, right? What if preventing these issues down the line is as simple as standing up for yourself? So try to look throughout your day as much as you can. And every time you notice, you don't have to be worried about it all the time, but every time you notice how you're standing, fix your posture and see if that makes any difference in the pain you feel. And maybe you have no pain at all, which is awesome. Or maybe even just your capacity to breathe. Maybe you find you're able to take a better breath when you're standing taller. Hope you guys have a great rest of your week, and I'll see you around.